fear that the only way to stop those possessed by the spirits of the book is through the act of bodily dismemberment.
Evil Dead is a series where everyone involved really swung for the fences. A few scrappy guys from Michigan, barely old enough to grow hair on their chins, sweet-talked their relatives and some retired dentists into financing a movie about demons terrorizing a group of 20-somethings in a cabin in the woods. The shoot was long and grueling, cast and crew sleeping in the same freezing, dirty cabin in which they filmed. Director Sam Raimi got a concussion while filming. Bruce Campbell put his family's property up for collateral to secure the necessary funds to finish the film. The cast, the crew, the investors all put their health, their lives, and their livelihoods all on the line, resulting in a beloved cult classic, which then led to a series of equally beloved sequels. Evil Dead could have failed, but at least it would have failed big. Evil Dead Rise, meanwhile, needed some of that same swinging for the fences mentality. Instead, what we got is a movie that plays it safe, that presents the notion that a safe Evil Dead is even possible. Where the film falters most of all is in its style. If you're going to make an Evil Dead movie, you need to make your mark stylistically. No, you don't have to Dutch every angle, you don't have to do a bunch of crash zooms. On the contrary, a director should try and carve out their own signature sort of bombast. Even still though, Evil Dead should be bombastic. Director Lee Cronin, meanwhile, seems like he would rather be making another A24 film, like his 2019 debut feature, The Hole in the Ground. Watching Evil Dead Rise, I was reminded just as much of Hereditary as I was Evil Dead. If a filmmaker is going to break stylistic continuity from Sam Raimi, which again, maybe they should, I'm not sure they should then go in the direction of every other mid-budget atmosphere-first horror movie that's come out in the wake of A24's initial success. Here's the same soft, diffused lighting and shallow depth of field that every filmmaker raised on DSLR cameras seems to have settled on for whatever reason, a moodier brand of wedding video. Here's the horror with a thick slather of washed-out millennial angst. If the crime movies of the 1970s were all made while everybody was high on cocaine, the horror movies of the 2010s and onward are all being made while everybody's burnt out on antidepressants. Evil Dead Rise goes a step further by getting jokey and meta with the Evil Dead style, when at the beginning of the film, what is assumed to be the signature POV of the evil entity is revealed to be a guy flying a drone. The scene is part of this bookend segment that I sincerely don't know why it was included other than to say, look, a cabin in the woods, just like Evil Dead. Even though, again, it more resembles the temple from Midsummer or the witch's house from Gretel and Hansel than it does the cabin from Evil Dead. Getting weird and meta in an Evil Dead movie is already enough of a red flag, but it also lends to this idea that director Cronin would rather be doing anything else, despite apparently being handpicked by Sam Raimi and company to direct the project. With a somber, self-serious A24 visual style comes a somber, self-serious tone. Why these more recent reboots seem to gravitate towards the more straightforward tone of the original Evil Dead, while getting rid of so much of the fun of the sequels, I don't know. One clumsy attempt at replicating the tone of the sequels comes in the form of just copying a scene from one of them almost note for note. Hey, remember that eyeball gag from Evil Dead 2? Well, here it is again. There you go, nerds. The movie seems to think it's enough to touch on certain Evil Dead bullet points, the Necronomicon, the shotgun, the chainsaw, and then just call it a day. What new elements Evil Dead Rise does bring to the table then end up undercooked. The idea of deadites in an LA high-rise apartment is a fine idea for a concept, until it becomes apparent that the most we're going to see of the high-rise is just the one floor, the lobby, and a parking garage. The movie lacks any real sense of verticality. Sure, there's the elevator, but then everywhere else is conveniently out of bounds. The stairs are torn apart, like the bridge, get it? The fire escape is locked behind some impenetrable door. I get that it's a sort of conceit to keep everyone trapped in one place, but you're telling me that in a movie where the main selling point is that it takes place in a high-rise apartment, that no one falls out of a window? You're telling me there's no hair-raising set piece that takes place on the exterior of the building? Why not have the climax of the movie take place on the roof? I get that the parking garage might be the equivalent of the basement in Evil Dead, but it just seems like one of many missed opportunities to really set the movie apart, to really sell the change in location. The idea of the apartments being built on top of an old bank is another neat idea that never really seems to amount to much after the book is found. It never amounts to much either plot-wise or thematically, assuming it's meant to say something about class or urban decay. There's also what seems to be this effort in both the 2013 reboot and now in Evil Dead Rise to reposition the series as a more female-led horror franchise. On the one hand, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a staple of the genre. The young woman battling the forces of evil and in doing asserting her autonomy and her self-possession. On the other hand, that's kind of what made Evil Dead so different, was that it subverted the typical final girl cliché into that of the final guy. The forces of darkness reduce a young, all-American boy into a sniveling mess from which he must assert his autonomy and his self-possession. If the 3 original movies have a loose continuity plot-wise, there's a more defined character through line in Ash's journey from shrieking victim to one-liner spouting demon hunter savant, from boy to man. One gets the sense that repositioning Evil Dead into a more traditional female-driven horror franchise is to quote-unquote fix the tree rape scene from the original. Evil Dead Rise, of course, pays homage to that scene while skirting all the grimy, lecherous qualities of the original. The movie wants to imitate the uncompromising tone of the original Evil Dead while leaving out those elements that might be considered truly unsafe by more modern mainstream audiences. Meanwhile, the gore and the special effects in Evil Dead Rise, while inarguably well done, seem to lack some certain visceral quality. Maybe it's because by now it's all so routine. Maybe it's that something about it is too polished, while the original Evil Dead felt genuinely dingy and grimy. Maybe it's that the characters are too lacking in personality to really sympathize with. Evil Dead owes so much to Bruce Campbell's charisma that if you take him out of the equation, you better have someone or something to take up the slack. All we have in Evil Dead Rise is, again, a comparatively flat directorial style as a backdrop to a handful of angsty millennials and non-binary zoomers. The idea of the family all mashing themselves together into the one monster at the end, while a fun idea, is kind of weird thematically. Looking at it, I assume the audience is meant to think of family as this potentially oppressive, conforming force, except it would have made much more sense had the characters actually been depicted that way. Everybody, apart from a few cursory spats, seems to more or less get along. The whole thing might have made more impact if it was a story about a woman who really didn't fit in or wasn't welcomed by her family, than being confronted by this sort of demonic embodiment of her own alienation. If that was supposed to be the point, I don't think it really comes across too well. In the end, there's nothing terribly wrong with Evil Dead Rise, but then again, there's nothing terribly right with it either. It's a movie that needed to be either completely divorced from Evil Dead, needed to be its own story set in its own universe, or else it needed to better capture what made the series so unique in the first place, instead of a loose collection of nostalgic bullet points. The movie seemed to do pretty well financially, meaning another one is probably coming sooner rather than later. The idea of some sort of interconnected Marvel-style Evil Dead universe as described by Bruce Campbell really doesn't get my hopes up for any future installments. At the end of the day, I think the real obstacle is that you can't really manufacture something like The Evil Dead, or rather you can't just plug in the next suitably competent up-and-coming director and expect them to recapture the desperate artistic fervor of the originals. Filmmaking, and probably the world at large, has become too soft, too accommodating, and too jaded to ever really replicate what those plucky Michigan boys did back in 1981. The most you can ever really hope for then is a decent enough homage to the original. That and something to pass the time.